Good evening, everyone. As you're coming in, you should see closed captioning enabled. And you can also click out of that. I'm just going to wait for another 30 seconds or so for people to come in, and then we're going to get started today. Okay, we'll get started slowly here. Our presentation tonight is going to be about 45 minutes to an hour, and I'll certainly get you out within the hour. My name is Tal Kitron with Alperuth Tutoring Services. I work as a premium tutor and executive function coach, and I mainly do test prep, so PSAT, ACT, and then what we're here for today, which is the new digital SAT. If you have questions as we go, please put them in the Q&A, and I will get to those at the end. And just want to talk a little bit about what Alperuth offers, just very briefly. Our three cornerstones are tutoring academically. So if you have a student who's struggling in school with a certain class or subject or AP exam, test prep, which again is my bread and butter, and then executive function coaching. And here's what we're going to cover today. So our itinerary is about just what's the timeline. Most of the big shifts have already happened last year. So we're going to talk about 2024 and beyond. We'll then look at the format. So I already see questions about that. We're definitely going to talk about changes from the paper test and the new format. We'll look at the content of the first two modules, which are both reading and writing, and some strategies that you can use there. Then same for math, which is modules 3 and 4. And then just look at some techniques, because this digital test has a whole bunch of new tools we can use. So thinking about what to bring and what you can do on your practice and then official test. So here's kind of where we're at. In March of last year, internationally, the test went digital. So I was working with students in Italy and Spain and South America who were taking the test digitally already last year because they were non-domestic students. All juniors in October of 2023, sometimes in November, took the PSAT digitally. So that was the first real preview of what the new test looks like. PSAT scores came back around Thanksgiving, which used to be more like Christmas. And that will be the case for the new SAT as well. And then in 2023, December 2nd was the final paper SAT. So the paper SAT is no longer a thing. We'll talk about what that means for testing timeline and all that. But in March of this year, I believe it's March 10th, let me check that. March 9th, at Saturday, is the first official digital SAT in the US. So that'll be given at a test center, which will be like a school or a computer lab, right? And we're going to talk about what that looks like. But as of this March, as of this year, all SATs are now digital. So they're all computer-based. The scoring actually hasn't changed. So here's the broad format, and then we'll dig into each section a little bit more. The score is out of 1,600. Minimum you can get is 400 for just entering your name. Both verbal and math are out of 800 total, and then they're added for your total score. So 1,600 is still the perfect benchmark. And then the most, I think, interesting thing, one of the most interesting things is that it's adaptive. So it's a section adaptive test, meaning module 1 is a set form, module 2 is adaptive. Section 3, the first math module, is a set form, and then section 4 is adaptive. So let's talk about what that means. So the test is not question adaptive. It is section adaptive, meaning you should not expect to see like each question change difficulty based on how you do. What will happen is that you'll see 2 reading modules, so module 1 and 2, but section 2 will vary based on how you did on section 1. And again, section 3 is math, and based on how you do on section 3, section 4 will either be easier or harder. One of the things that's an advantage of digital is there's no one set test form. So you're not gonna be able to talk to your friends. You're not supposed to anyway, but you can't say afterwards, like, hey, what'd you get for number 7? Because their number 7 was very likely different than yours. And then something else that we can't really pay too much attention to, but is the case, is that earlier questions, often easier questions, can affect your overall score more than later ones. And if you get to module 2 and you're like, dang, this is really easy, that's probably not a great sign, right? That means we're on the easier module for the adaptive section. And we don't want that. We want to get into the harder second module so that our score ceiling is higher and our floor is higher as well. So again, based on how you do on section 1 and 3, sections 2 and 4 will either be easier or more difficult. Very interesting new change. I've already seen a couple questions come through, and again, I'll get to those at the end about administration. So here's how the digital SAT now works. Gone are the days of sitting down and bubbling in Scantron sheets for an hour. Instead, we're going to download the Blue Book app onto a personal laptop or tablet. So you have to have a device that does this. If you don't, ideally your school will provide one, like a Chromebook or something where they can download Blue Book for you. But the idea is every student brings their own device in. You'll register for the test, months in advance. You can already register for the March and May SATs online. But then in the week leading up to the test, a few days before, there's a process to register again, which basically allows you to download the test. Can't see it, you kind of downloaded this code. And then on test day, when you load the Blue Book app, it'll block other apps from running. So you're not gonna be able to go out and Google something, not that would help. You'll enter a code at the test center and the proctor is just there to say, start now. And as soon as you enter the code and start, the test will be activated and unlocked. And we'll look today at what that digital format looks like, so what you're going to see and what tools you can use. Right, so everyone using their own device and the Blue Book app. Mentioned some of these, but so far I like the test a lot. So one of the biggest things is proctors are notoriously awful. Not all of them, but I've heard horror stories. Even if they just, they aren't paying attention, right? Or they're eating during the test, or they're in the hallway talking, or they stop the time too soon, right? So we kind of have eliminated the need now for human proctors for the most part. So the test itself is more consistent. Same thing with no scantrons, right? So there's no miss bubbles or anything that will cost you a point for a silly reason. We'll talk about how schools are doing a lot more school day testing. So you'll see a lot of April SATs in school now, right? So you don't have to abide just by the March, May, June, August official dates. The digital test, because there's no one set form, you're not going to see tests leak. And so test administrations shouldn't have to be canceled like they have in the past. I'm a big fan of the accommodations for students with LDs. So there's bigger fonts and there's different color coding and just a lot of good things for students with processing or ADD or dyslexia. Results come back fast. So not immediately, but within days of the test. And then again, we're going to look at just the test itself and how it compares to the old paper SAT and the current ACT. But we can be efficient. It's knowing a lot about a little rather than knowing a little bit about a lot. So here are some of the big changes. The paper SAT, not including the essay portion, which no longer exists. So there is no more SAT essay, not a thing. But the 4 sections on the old SAT would be about a little over 3 hours for regular time. The new digital SAT is more like 2.5 hours. So really a really nice boon, especially for students with extended time, right? Because if you have ADHD and you get time and a half and we need it, that's good, but then you're in the test center for 5 hours, right? So that can cause other issues. Now time and a half is a little bit over 3.5 hours. It's manageable. There's a lot more time per question, so it's not as much of a test as speed, which I think is a very good thing. The reading and writing sections are now combined into verbal, and there are fewer grammatical concepts. I can count them on probably one hand. Shorter reading passages, gone are the days of long 10-question passages, but they still cover a pretty wide range of topics. And then another big change is on the math. Not only do we have a drop-down Desmos calculator, which we'll look at a lot later, but we can also, there's no no-calc section. So you can use a calculator throughout. A lot of students really didn't like the no-calc of the previous SAT. So more time, it's more of just kind of a real math-based test for the math, I think is nice. And yeah, just I think more efficient, more manageable. I mentioned the school day testing. So the digital test, the big advantage is just there's more flexibility, right? So there'll be like Fridays in school that, hey, we're offering an SAT, right? So look at your school's calendar to see if that's an option. It's a really good idea to take like the school day April SAT and then the May one or something like that back to back, because it's just great experience. And then you'll know what to expect after that first test. You can see in the past 5 years or so, it's almost doubled as far as the popularity of in-school testing. So it's not just those Saturday dates. A lot has stayed the same. So of course the digital SAT is a big switch, but the content itself, there's not that much of a difference. Math is testing the same material, but with fewer word problems. So less of a reading burden. They did this, I think, partially for international students and students with English as a second language, because they felt that, and I felt this too, working with some students, where we would get to the math sections of SAT and it still feels like we're reading, right? A lot of word problems. So that's much less so now. And then the other thing staying the same is the scoring. So it's still out of 1600. If we find that the scores from digital to paper are truly equivalent, we have no indication to believe they're not, then the current concordance tables with ACT will work, right? So like a 1500 on SAT is like a 34 on ACT. That will still be the case. All right, let's dig into the format. So here's what you got is 2 modules for reading and writing, 27 questions, 32 minutes. And we'll look at the individual question types and how that's set up. Of those 54 questions, 4 of them will be experimental. That's not something that we can really think about or consider as we go. You just focus on the question in front of you. But there used to be an experimental 5th section to gather data for future tests. Instead, now they've sprinkled these experiment questions in to the other sections. So just throughout. And what that means is that there are a couple questions that won't count per test. And then for math, you've got 22 questions, 35 minutes, so a bit more time per question. And you should find the first module getting harder towards the end, and the second module will either be easier or harder depending on how we did. It's a total of just over 2 hours for under 100 questions, which compares really nicely to old SAT and paper and ACT. That's what this slide indicates. Yeah, most of the questions so far that you guys are asking, we will get to. But yes, again, so digital SAT, shorter test, but also more time per question. That combination just makes for a better test taking experience, to be honest. So time per question significantly increased from the paper SAT and the ACT. Here's that in statistical form, which is we have 60% more time per question on verbal and about the same on math. Right, so again, like if you had previously 45 seconds for a question, now we've got more like a minute 20. That's enormous. The biggest crunch will still be probably on the verbal sections. I've noticed people running out of time a little bit on modules 1 and 2, especially 2, less so on math. For math, most people are now having enough time to get to everything. The ACT, for the record, is notoriously a fast-paced test, like 40 questions in 35 minutes on some sections. So that is one thing that turns people off of the ACT a lot of times, is it's easier, simpler, but very fast-paced. Lot fewer time per question, less time per question. I mentioned this, but these experimental questions will be sprinkled in. So 8%, approximately 8 of the 98 total questions will be experimental. That will allow College Board to gather data for future tests, and it helps the tests stay pretty short, right? They can just kind of keep doing this. So not something we need to think about as test takers very much. Let's talk content and strategies of our new digital SAT. The below strategies apply to both verbal and math, and we should use them throughout. The first one is a little bit complicated because one of the biggest things of tutoring used to be pencil in hand, right? Active reading, underline, circle, star, take little notes. You still have scratch paper, and I'm a big proponent of still taking little notes, but we're also going to look at the tools we have of annotating. So you can highlight with different colors, you can underline, you can make a little text box and type a note. Very close attention to what the question's asking and what the answer choices are giving us. So active reading is still going to be very important on all sections. Answer eliminator is going to be a big tool we use, which is exactly what it sounds like. You select it at the beginning of the test and you just eliminate answers, and I'll show you that. Same with Desmos. And then just like the old SAT, there's no guessing penalty, no points off for wrong answers. So if you don't know the answer or you're out of time, do select something, right? I put C here because you want to go straight down the line. Meaning, if you go A, B, C, D, C, B, A, B, C, D, Christmas treeing it, you're likely to miss every single one. Whereas statistically, if you go straight down the line with one answer of the day, C, 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 you'll probably get at least a couple, and that can be the difference of 20, 30 points, right? So leave nothing blank. Let's look at just a little bit more about the reading and writing section, so you can see here kind of what that looks like. I mentioned it's 32 minutes, 27 questions. Gives us a little bit over a minute per question, but some of them will be quick. Like if you see on the left side, we always start with vocab, always. And some people, you know, if you're a reader, writer, if you know the 4 words that are given, those could go pretty quickly. We'll look at other questions later that take longer and other grammar questions that might be, again, quite a bit quicker. The longest passage you'll ever see now is 2 paragraphs. So we know we don't have any more that are just like long passages. That's totally gone. It's just short passage, 1 question per short passage. Right, and that's what we see here, and what we're going to see on the next few slides. As soon as you click start, right, so you download the code, you're in the test center, and you start either a practice blue book digital SAT or a real one. This is what comes up. The clock's at the top of the screen, starts to count down. You can hide that if it makes you nervous, but I think it's a fine thing to have up there. And let's just kind of look at what we've got. So the biggest thing that I would say is, again, this one. Answer eliminator, I select it and I keep it selected. Because you can have it selected and still pick a correct answer, but it allows you just to cross out the bad ones. Mark for review is another good tool. So if it's a question that you're not sure of, or you're taking too long, you want to skip, you mark for review, and then when you hit this down here, you'll be able to see all the questions and very easily which ones you've marked. And then finally, in this annotate feature, again, you can make a text box, write a note, which could be just a note for yourself or a summary, and then you can highlight and you can underline. So in the old test, you couldn't use a highlighter, and now we can do that. So those color coding tools can help. And then in the more, the 3 dots, there's not a whole lot there, to be honest. That's when you want to like save and exit for a practice test, but we shouldn't have to use that on testing. Here is the first question type that you will always see. So the first thing you'll always see on a digital SAT test day is a vocab question. There are 4 types. There's definition, there's synonyms, there's antonyms, and then there's what we call literary narrative, basically. Part of what I would do in tutoring via the Appleruth SAT guide, we have a new digital 5th edition, is look at what are some clues that tell you which type of question it is. So like here, I would say, all right, we're going to read the passage and come up with our own prediction, not looking at these answers yet. And keywords on the left that we might underline or highlight: frustrated with the blank of terms. This author coined a new term, and it focuses on what is and can / will be rather than what could have been. So it's going to be, he's frustrated with something bad about existing terms, right? Saying basically like that they're just not inclusive enough. So it's not going to be frustrated with the precision, because precision is usually positive. And then not obscurity, because obscure means something that's like not very well known or kind of hidden to most people. And so we'd be down at A and B, and then you could plug in and see which one you like better. Here, limitations make sense because it's a negative word, frustrated with the limitations of existing terms. And that's the process, right? Sometimes we know the word immediately, other times we eliminate and get there. But every verbal module will always start with 2 to 6 vocab questions. Then once you get to the kind of early middle of the reading modules, the verbal modules, you're going to start to see command of evidence, which for my money are often the harder ones. These also include graph questions, but here you're going to have some sort of job to do. Like our job is, which quote illustrates the claim? So in our heads, we've got to be thinking, okay, what is the claim? And there's not a whole lot of info, but then you read here, and the claim is that the changes in the season are comparable to the attitude of this person's beloved, so a person. And then we go through the answers, and we kind of look at, okay, which answer shows season and kind of compares it to attitude. This is a very hard question. There's not much context, but A doesn't really mention a person. Maybe. Same with B, same with C, right? Those are all about the nature and the changes, but I think D makes it seem like we're talking about a person and personifying maybe the winter season. I think generally those are some of the hardest questions, like I said, but you can work on them. The biggest, I think the main process is predict the answer as best you can and then eliminate choices, right? Keep it pretty simple. Third verbal question type is inference. Inference questions always go like this: which choice most logically completes the text? And I again think these are some of the harder questions. We need to focus in on transition words, like however. I think there are also certain like surprise words that can help. So like unfortunately or immediately, right? Or just little things can help you see what's the vibe and where am I transitioning. In this case, for example, polyurethanes are commonplace. They're durable, they're versatile. However, they're difficult to recycle. They're researching this new alternative. Initial tests are positive because they can recycle it. As the research continues, they'll need to determine whether their bio-based foams do what, though. So they're recyclable, but are they going to be as durable and as versatile as polyurethanes? That's what ends up leading us to B, but you can also see why the other answers don't work. Not about comfort. Paper pulp industry is kind of ancillary to this question, irrelevant. And it's not about them being appealing, it's about whether they work well. Right. So again, these questions sometimes take people a while. Some people need to skip them, right? And even with a tutor or in a group class, it takes some work to perfect these. And then finally, at the end of every verbal module, you'll see these questions. And for my money, these are the easiest. Because the rule is you do not need the bullet points. So I'm gonna leave this up for a moment. And if you guys just want to try, read the question, read the answers, and ignore the bullets. See which answer answers the question. For each of these set of verbal questions, we're always looking at the question first. So it's usually question and then passage, but in this case, we don't need the bullet points. So always question first on verbal. And then once we've predicted our answer, we use process of elimination. Our job here is introduce the research of these two people to an audience already familiar with global warming. Well, A doesn't introduce the research, and neither does D. They don't mention the people at all. They don't mention the research. B, global warming continues to be a major concern. Okay, so I see the familiarity, and they're planning a strategy to combat it using volcanoes. Not bad. And then C, they're using their expertise on how volcanic particles move around the atmosphere to determine if major eruptions could mitigate global warming. Well, that's clearly more effective, right? That introduces the research, whereas this just says their goal. And I never looked over here, but I'm sure there's some backup to it. On the hardest bullet point questions, you can look at those. But the goal would be to have these be quick and easy so that we can spend more time and energy on the harder questions in the middle. Right, so ignore the bullet points. That has proven to be an effective strategy so far. The other thing they do right before those bullet point questions is they test grammar. So they call this boundaries and then form and structure, I think. So one of the first things I would do in a tutoring session is talk about punctuation rules. Right, for our purposes, periods and semicolons are pretty much the same with a couple exceptions. Because the rule for them is they separate two independent clauses, which is two full sentences. Commas can't do that. And then colons, which people don't like to use, people overuse commas and don't like colons, but a colon has to have an independent clause before it. And then those two dots are like a drum roll, please, to introduce the next thing. I had one great passion in life. Drum roll, please, what was it? Making pizzas. So expect clauses and punctuation rules to be tested quite a bit. Also, you'll see a little bit of connectors, misplaced modifier, a few other grammar topics. Here's a clause question. So we go straight to the answers for grammar. And what I would tell my students is, are there any semicolons or periods? Because those are pretty easy to test, plus they're identical. So is there any difference between A and B? And the answer in this case is no. So they're both wrong. They can't both be right because we can't have two right answers. So they're wrong. And the reason they're wrong in this case is because the second clause after the period or semicolon is dependent. It's not a full sentence. So then we would test C and D, and when in doubt, we cut commas out. But in this case, she dedicated herself to mycology, the study of fungi producing more than 350 paintings. No, this is not all one idea. So it can't be C. It's going to have to be the study of fungi, comma, and then producing dependent clause. So there's a lot of tools we can use to eliminate answers quickly. However, and nevertheless are the same. That's another one that's an easy fit, an easy like, let's cross two out if they're both there. Same with therefore and consequently. They mean the same thing. I mentioned connectors. So take a look here before, and then if a connector is in the middle of a sentence like it is here, logically it's here. We're comparing this part to this part, not the sentence that has the connector in it. So that can be a bit weird. Organisms have evolved a number of surprising adaptations to ensure their survival in adverse conditions. Blank, I'm just putting a blank here for our purposes. Tadpole shrimp embryos can pause development for over 10 years. So I would ask myself, contrast, yes or no? These ideas aren't contrasting, right? They're very similar. So I can cross out any contrast words. And then is it a cause effect, right? Does one thing cause the other, or is it just an example of the prior statement? I would say it's an example. Right, so connector questions actually can be quite tricky, but just understand what are we comparing, and is there a contrast connection, or do they go together? That usually gets us down to two answers, sometimes one. All right, and then last verbal question type isn't really verbal at all, it's graphs. This is command of evidence still, is what it's called. If we're lucky, if it's an easy graph question, 3 of the choices will just be false. More often though, the choices will all be true, and then we need to pick the choice that logically makes sense. So we need to read the whole paragraph, title, x-axis, y-axis. These are the questions where you want to take a bit of time and be a perfectionist, which is usually not the case on SAT. So here you figure out what's the conclusion, and then look at which of these choices is both true and would weaken it. We may come back to this, but we're about halfway, and I want to get into the math. The math format is 2 35-minute modules with 22 questions. So it's actually a little bit, it's interesting that it's more time per question on math. I think the reason behind that is there are a few pretty hard math questions on every module. And also there's those feelings of, geez, I should know this. I learned it freshman year and I've forgotten, right? So a lot of math prep is just refreshing things we've learned and forgotten or didn't learn properly. I mentioned this, the paper SAT was much more of a reading heavy test, very wordy, and the digital SAT is more of a pure math test. So as opposed to 70% word problems, it's actually more like 70% math now and 30% word problems. That math reference sheet is provided, and I'll show you what the format looks like, I think, in a few slides. 24% fewer problems, but actually we get more time, interestingly. There's no calculator section. It just feels generally more manageable. Part of that is for like those ESL students, many fewer words per problem. I just think that this is a nice change and it makes the math sections just really all about math, mostly algebra. And this is a little bit of background on that. That's kind of more high level, so don't need to dig into this very much, but the takeaway is more of a math test, less of a reading test now. There are still what we call grid-ins or free response or student-produced response questions. They used to be at the end of the math sections, now they are mixed in. It's going to be 8 of 98 questions, so 4 of 22 questions. So for each section, 4 out of 22 will be grid-ins. One difference is you can now grid in a negative number. We did not used to be able to do that. There are also 5 boxes because of that instead of 4. And they actually always give you this little table. You don't want to have to look at it on test day, but before that you want to see like, okay, what can I grid in and what can I not? So 3.5, if that's your answer, 7/2, 3.5, 3.50, those are all good. But if you try to enter it as a mixed number, that's not going to look right. And then that middle one, like 2/3, right? I just put the fraction in. I feel like that's the safest. Because if you truncate the decimal too soon, they will count that as wrong. So when in doubt, use fractions. And there is a way on the graphing calculator to turn any decimal into a fraction if it is rational. That's by hitting the math button on a TI-83 or TI-84, or really any TI-80, whatever. But if you do like 7 divided by 12 and you get a decimal, you can then hit math and enter on frac, and it'll turn it back to a fraction. That is a tool that we can use. Honestly, the Desmos calculator makes that even easier. So here's what math looks like. Right, we're going to start. They put the time up. And then on the top right, the biggest thing by far is the calculator. Just so you know, that looks like this. If anyone has ever used Desmos, which most of my students have, it's desmos.com/calculator. It is wild how much this can do. Right? So like for this question, we would graph it. And I've now told people, you know, as a person who likes math and likes teaching math, some of it's hard because I want to teach the actual way to do it, but it's not helpful. It's not efficient. It's not the best way. So like where I used to tell people, let's factor this, and some people I still might, you could also just graph this and then graph the answers and see which ones match. It's silly, but it works. Right? So you graph x squared plus 5x minus 50 on Desmos. We look at, oh, that's a parabola with intercepts here and here, and then you compare that to the answers. The other thing to look at here besides the answer eliminator is the math reference thing, that x squared on the top, and that is just the geometry formulas. So area, circumference of a circle, special right triangles, Pythagoras, and so on. This drop-down calculator, I can't really emphasize enough what a big difference it's made. You can open it and close it, expand it, or just keep it open. And some people in some questions call for like just your graphing calculator, which you should always have as well. But any like polynomial question, like you can see up here, they've graphed a parabola. Almost always it's going to be better to do it this. If they're asking about the vertex, right, or the intercepts, we can just see it on screen. I'm playing with this and just seeing, okay, trying to remember algebra 1 and algebra 2 and what you've forgotten, I think in itself can be helpful, right? But we do a lot of this in session time. That's how you gain fluency. You can figure out how to make, mean, median, mode. We can find all that on Desmos. You can use the slider tool to move a graph up and down and kind of predict what an answer will be. The easy module, you should expect a lot of basic algebra, so like linear equations and stuff. And I think people who use Desmos find it like stupidly easy. And then section 2, we're gonna have some harder ones. But if we get that first math module to feel really simple and make it to the higher level second math module, that's a win in and of itself. Look at the content distribution and how it's tilted so much to algebra. Because algebra and advanced math both encompass algebra 1 and 2 pretty much. We've still got a little bit of stats and a little bit of geometry and trig. They've actually upped that a tiny bit from the old SAT. But vast majority of our SAT questions are just going to be algebra. So that's the stuff to review if you were kind of doing a short-term study plan. For every question on math, you want to read the question, aka what am I solving for? Then think, is there a simple step? How do I do this? Am I going to write out an equation? Am I plugging in, or do I graph it? Don't skip steps as you calculate, right? You still have scratch paper. You should write things down. And then do make sure, like, did they ask me for X or Y? Did I solve for the right thing? Almost all of my mistakes used to be something like that, or a negative instead of a positive. And I always like to tell my students this as well, because a big part of math struggles, especially with confidence, tends to be, well, once I get going, I'm fine, but I'm not sure where to start. What is this question asking? So we should always have this basic algebra checklist. Can you isolate a variable? Can we combine like terms, factor, FOIL, distribute, or substitute? Everyone has done some of that at least at some point. And then if none of those work, we're not screwed. We use the answer choices, or maybe Desmos, or maybe pick our own numbers to plug in. Right? So those are all just like, it's important not to give up if you feel like, oh, there's no simple step. Think, what's my shortcut? There's usually a simple solution. One of those simple strategies would be working backwards. The reality is now I would probably do this question on Desmos, but it would be very easy to just plug in the answers to a question like this. We're solving for X, and which value does not work. So you just plug in until you get an inequality that isn't true. Right? That would be much easier for some people than doing the actual math, although the algebra here is not hard either. And then picking numbers, I think, is a huge strategy for SAT more than ACT. Because it helps you just put these remaining modeling questions, these word problems, into math terms. For example, here, it's saying we double every 12 hours, and there's 100,000 to start. So the answer choices, to me, really help. If we know exponential modeling, we know that A and B are showing 2 cells to start, and they're growing by a factor of 100,000. So it's C or D. And then they're saying every 12 hours. So I would plug in T is days. So I'm going to plug in, let's say 1 day. I don't expect this to happen twice. This is my answer. Because I plug in for C, we get 1/12, which means in 1 day, it hasn't doubled yet. Whereas here, it doubles twice in 1 day. So it doubles every 12 hours. That takes practice. The plugging in 0 and 1 actually do work a lot on digital tests. It used to be something we said, don't pick 0 and 1. They do weird things. I want to spend 10 or so minutes talking about the content areas and just briefly looking at examples. And I see a bunch of questions, so we're going to save some time for that. 35%, so 13 to 15 out of our 44 questions are going to be basic algebra. That's y equals mx plus b, really mostly that. Sometimes 2 linear equations, sometimes inequalities. Those can almost all be done on Desmos. So I used to have to teach, hey, systems of equations, let's eliminate, or let's isolate and substitute. Now we just graph it. Here are 2 examples of Algebra 1 problems. The first one would be a classic one to either distribute or just graph them both, is probably what I would do. And that first one is asking how many times do these lines intersect? The answer would be 0 times because they have the same slope but different y-intercepts. And that'll be a review that people are like, oh yeah, I think we remember that from sophomore year. And then for the second one on the right side, they're asking just what is y? So I would plug in 0 for y and then 1 for y and see what happened. So clearly 1800 y, so it has to do with the residence area, not the industrial, right? So the answers help us a lot. And then if the total number is 520, that means this is total, which means y must be the average. I think that's tricky, but if you get it down to B and D, we did most of our job. And then with practice, you can get down to the best answer. Then advanced math, which again is also algebra, just like algebra 2. This is the polynomial stuff. So stuff that people often haven't learned very well, or if it was during the COVID year, have some gaps. But stuff like vertex form and standard form and intercept form and factoring, right? A lot of this can be graphed. Here are 2 questions, both of which are in the advanced math realm. The first one is just a matter of what am I solving for? Oh, isolate 3k minus 2. So you multiply both sides by the denominator. That's how we get rid of fractions. And we wouldn't distribute. We would just divide by 3n and be done. D as in dog. Multiply both sides by 3k minus 2. Divide by 3n. And then the one on the right is absolutely a graph question. Graph that in Desmos. And the question is, what height, from what height was the ball dropped? So the other thing you could do here is, if you think logically, well, the ball is dropped at that time, 0 seconds have passed. If I plug in 0 right here, I'm getting that h of 0, in other words, the height when time is 0, all we're going to have left is 600, right? So that's going to, if you graphed it, it would look like that with the point 0, 600. And that's stuff that, again, a lot of people haven't learned properly. We really need to review vertex form and standard form and what those are. But with practice and with Desmos, you can get really, really good at that in a short time. Then 2 more question types. One is problem solving and data analysis. This is stats mostly, but it's basic statistics like probability, mean, median, mode, range, stuff like that. Here's how that'll look. These are both calculator questions. The first one would be, what percentage of the tiles are ceramic? So that means 1.248 million is what percent of 1.6 million? And then you would just divide both sides by this to figure it out, right? So in other words, it's really going to be 1,248,000 over this would be how we solve. So it's going to be one of those two. And then I'm a broken record, but this one's also a Desmos question, because if you want to find the mean, you will go to Desmos, you'll drop it down, you'll write mean parentheses, and then you'll just enter these numbers, and you'll find the mean of both data sets, and then compare them. Right, in this case, I think data set T will definitely have a bigger average because it has the same numbers without this low one. Right, so it'll be B for that one. The biggest thing with digital SAT math is because there are so few question types, you can really, I think, game the system by knowing exactly what to expect, right? If you've practiced all the hard level questions that they have to offer, you're probably going to get them right on test day. All right, home stretch. So geometry and trig, SOHCAHTOA, basic SOHCAHTOA, right triangles, but remember that they do have formulas. If you ever get a shape question, you should draw out the shape and label everything. Here are some examples. In the interest of saving time, we won't do them, but I want you to look at the left side and see, oh, that's probably Pythagoras, because you've got a right triangle and a hypotenuse and a square root. And the right side is something most people have forgotten, which is alternate interior, alternate exterior angles. So like z plus x is 180, and z equals y, because they're both the outside angles. People need a lot of review usually with geometry trig because it's often been since freshman year, but the Appleruth guide is really good with that. We've got some videos, and it's just easy to knock off for us. So I want to spend just a few minutes showing you how we can use Desmos for, like, not most, but many, many questions. Here's an example. I used to teach this as, all right, well, we better either make like the x terms the same and eliminate, or we should isolate x and plug in for y. But now we're just going to graph them. The question was, what does y equal? Well, when these intersect, it looks like y is 3. So you graph them, you put your mouse over the point of intersection, and it will literally tell you, well, x is 5, y is 3. Just make sure you pick the correct variable that we're solving for. So those questions are now a piece of cake, if you do them right. This one's a little bit different, but zeros. So read the question. It says, what is the distance of line segment AB? A and B are zeros, x-intercepts of this graph. So instead of factoring or doing anything tough, we'll just graph it. We will locate the two x-intercepts, and we'll find the distance between them, which in this case is 6.5. So our answer is C, 6.5, because our zeros are 6.5 units apart, and all we did was graph what they gave us. So even just knowing what an x-intercept is and what a vertex is more than half the battle. Here's another one. They say 2x cubed minus 3x plus 4, and they've got 4 tables. So we're going to graph the original, and you can actually type table, and it'll make the table for you, and you can compare that to the answers. That is often overkill, so you could just graph this and look at the points, and that's usually enough for most people. But the table's a cool tool. Then finally, systems of inequalities. You can see this word problem. I'll do that up for just a moment. And so the big thing here is going to be setting up the inequality correctly. But if we do it, piece of cake. And then you'll have to train yourself a little bit and work on, okay, what am I actually solving for here? But the question was, how many laptops? What's the maximum number of laptops, which we made our y value? So our answer is going to be 102 because you can't buy 0.344 of a laptop, or at least you shouldn't. That's a tougher question that would take some practice. So recap, and then we'll open it up for questions because I see a bunch. Think about on math, what am I solving for? And then what do I already know? Show your work, don't leave anything blank. And then even though earlier questions that are easier might be worth more, if you're really stuck or straggling on a question, move past it. right? Go grab as many easy points as you can for you and mark questions for review as needed. Finally, testing timelines. Current juniors are the transitional class because the paper SAT finished at the end of last year. So one potential plan would be hybrid testing. If you've already taken a paper test, just switch to digital. It's a pretty easy transition. Most people like the digital test better. A lot of overlap. So that's a great option. Option two is just, okay, digital all the way. So I don't have an official SAT yet. I like the SAT better than the ACT, so I'm gonna do March, May, and August, or whatever. The digital PSAT in October is a good starting point. It'll give you some question types that you struggled with or did well with. And then option three is ACT all the way. So the ACT, there's a lot of things people like about it. Very simple, right? Easy passages. It's just very, very fast paced. There's a science section that's more about reading graphs than anything else. And then there's some pre-calc in the math. So the ACTs know a little bit about a lot rather than a lot about a little. We've got a couple new digital tests and we'll keep releasing materials and updating students and parents. I've been very pleased with how much we've been on the cutting edge. Every time the SAT changes, it was the same in 2015. We've got 2 full digital mocks that students can take. That's along with the 4 free practice tests on Blue Book. So downloading the Blue Book app. But if you do those tests, either the Blue Book or these digital ones for Appleruth, we give detailed score reports. I love working through those with students because we can look at which questions we missed and what types and so on. All right, we did it. Again, these are our cornerstones. My job is mostly test prep. You can request to work directly with me on digital SAT. Feel free to reach out to Appleruth at the number right there or at this email address. And if you're satisfied, hopefully this was helpful. I'm going to answer some questions, as many as I can in the next 5-6 minutes. But if you feel comfortable and satisfied, feel free to take off. And thank you for joining. All right, so let's see what we got question-wise. First one I answered, which is there's no essay section. There's no SAT essay. The next question is, can you superscore a digital SAT? So I'm imagining what you mean is if you take the March and May digital test, can you superscore? The answer to that, or if you're asking, can you superscore a paper in a digital, it depends on the college. I'd say about half of universities and colleges superscore, but many have not announced whether they will on digital SAT. But I would say majority will, at least half. So we'll look into the particular college. All right, next one is my son is signed up for the March 9th SAT and they said, bring your own laptop. How's that going to work? So yeah, I mean, that's it. You have to first get the Blue Book. You have to register for the test. Sounds like you have, but you have to download the Blue Book app on your device and make sure it's all ready to go. So that's one of the first things I would do. This is an answer to improving my SAT score. I would download the Blue Book app and start working through those digital SAT practice tests. The other best resources, I'm biased, but Appleruth's book is really good. The new fifth edition of the SAT guide. Working in a group class is helpful. Some people need to do individual tutoring, right? I often do like a 90-minute session once a week with students for a few weeks leading up to the test or a couple months. But yeah, there's a lot of different resources out there. Khan Academy, good too. The practice tests are also adaptive. So someone asked, is it just the actual SAT? But no, any good digital practice test will also be adaptive. And so you'll figure out, oh, I got into the higher difficulty module or I didn't. Another device question is, can you bring your school issued device? The answer is yes. Some schools prefer that you do it. Just make sure you can get Blue Book on it and that it works. Then about the adaptive nature. So will it lower your score if later questions become easier? The answer is if modules 2 and 4 are easier, then yes, your score ceiling is lower and your score floor is lower, right? So if you're in that lower scoring bracket, there's only a certain level you can get to, like 1300 or something. So yeah, if the later questions are easier, it's usually not a good sign for the score. Next question is about accommodations. It's a good question. I think you really want to talk to college counselor and make sure it's very tough to get in touch with College Board. but college counselors are usually the biggest one who help with accommodations. If you have an IEP or 504 plan in school, the SAT generally does accept those. So you just have to make sure you apply. And then the nice thing about digital is if you apply and you get your accommodations, it's not going to be up to a proctor who's, not on the ball. You'll get it built into your Blue Book system, right? So I would say look into this with College Counselor and College Board and make sure you've properly applied for those accommodations before the test. All right, most of these questions we've answered. We've gotten to a good amount of these. So there is no break in this test between modules 1 and 2. You'll do the verbal section for 35 and the next one. So we work for 70 minutes, then you get a 10-minute break, and then it's another 70 minutes on math. Just a couple more I want to ask. Someone asked if I can go back to the concept slide for math, so I'll do that real quick. It does not show you the SAT score right when you finish. That's another good question. Concept slide. I'm assuming you mean this. So yeah, I think when you finish the SAT, it's some college, like some higher, or I guess grad school test, you can get the score back immediately. It's not like that for the SAT, but it does come back within a matter of like a few days now. So within a week, the SAT scores will come back. To set up a table on Desmos, you have to click the little gear settings button, and then you should see the option to set up the table. But yeah, there's so many things on Desmos. Ask your peers, people who are really savvy with Desmos, and just practice with it. I've learned a lot. All right, the last question I want to answer, I'm sorry I couldn't get to everything. Some really, really good questions, but we had a bunch of people, so just couldn't get to all of it. But do feel free to reach out to Appleruth. People are really, really helpful there. And many of the people who work in the office have been or are tutors, so they really know their stuff. The last question I think is just a good one about test anxiety, right? How do I deal with it? This person says, on the day of PSAT, my nerves got to me. So here's my recommendation. First, think about positive test taking experiences, right? Because a lot of this is naming, oh, I'm anxious, right? Think about kind of why, right? And then Alperuth book has a really nice chapter on this, but think about like, what can I do to reduce this? Maybe it's test day preparation. Maybe it's going for a short run on the day of. A lot of it's going to be getting good sleep, and a lot of it's going to just be being prepared, right? This isn't a test to cram for, unlike a lot of tests that people do. This is a test of effort. So if you put in that effort and know what to expect, that'll quell your nerves. And finally, remember, a little bit of anxiety is okay, right? It's okay to be a bit stressed. That's actually a good thing. Just don't let it take over, right? So getting practice will help a lot. All right, again, sorry I didn't get to all the questions. Really good questions. Appreciate y'all joining, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thanks so much.